Good afternoon and welcome to our program today. The challenge for believers in every age is how are their scriptures and tradition relevant to the world in which they live? Our speakers today are men of faith and finance, whose unique book, Heavenly Returns, What the Abrahamic Faiths Teach Us About Financial and Spiritual Well-Being, I have found fascinating, informative, and insightful, and so invited them to join us. Dr. Yaqub Mirza helped design and launch some of the first and most successful Islamically aligned investment funds in the United States. He's founding trustee and chairman of the board of the Amana Mutual Funds, which has $6 billion in assets and is registered with the Security and Exchange Commission. He has written and spoken extensively about aligning faith and wealth management and is the author of 5 Pillars of Prosperity, Essentials of Faith-Based Wealth Building. Gary Moore is a retired investment manager and former senior vice president of Payne Webber. He has served on the boards of the John Templeton Foundation, Robert Schuller's Crystal Cathedral, Messiah College, and Opportunity International. And now we'll begin our program, and I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Professor Esposito. Greetings. I'm honored to be with you and presenting my remarks on this book, Heavenly Returns. As Professor Esposito mentioned, I co-founded Amana Mutual Fund and other investment asset management companies. I'm also a practicing lifelong Muslim and very interested in spiritual growth. Some people think that, there could be a dichotomy. How can you be in finance and managing assets and also believing in the Abrahamic traditions? But I believe that is a problem in our society, that we don't see these two domains, our spiritual beliefs and our pursuit of profit, as connected parts of more holistic life. Heavenly Returns offers a path for bringing these two areas of life, our finances and our spiritual beliefs, together. The backstory to Heavenly Returns is that several years ago, I wrote a book, 5 Pillars of Prosperity, talking about how earnings, savings, investing, spending, and giving can lead to prosperity. It was in talking about readers and audience that the seeds of Heavenly Returns book took shape. I was encouraged to speak with readers about their interest in the topic. More I talked to people, more I could see a broader demand across Abrahamic traditions to understand faith and wealth building together. I found, fortunately, that I was not alone, and I discovered Gary Moore was wondering about similar ideas and thoughts. Many years ago, I had the privilege of connecting with Gary Moore, who is a well-known writer and recovering fundamentalist, as he calls himself. He has written many books, which I have read, and I've learned a lot out of those books. On the surface, we could hardly be more different. He is Kentucky-born Southern Baptist who became an investment manager. I am a Pakistani-born Muslim with a PhD in physics. Yet we both are students of Abrahamic traditions who have spent much of our careers helping others grow and manage their wealth. Gary and I began communicating, and through that communication, this project took shape. There are a lot of commonalities which are talked about in the book. One of the most important lessons from the book is how much common ground we share, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, in how our faith can guide us to greater prosperity. It is easy to overlook these commonalities because there is so much attention given to things that separate us, such as the specific guidelines about tithing and interest. But in truth, those differences are so small compared to principles and core beliefs we share. In all Abrahamic traditions, wealth is an important part of life and importantly connected to our faiths. In talking to Gary, it was surprising how often we agreed. Islamically informed funds and Christian-based investment tend to avoid the same kinds of assets often called sin stocks. Another commonality is that using our faith to align investments help us see a longer-term horizon. These days, it can be tempting to look at nanosecond trading and short-term booms and busts. And certainly as the life can be tempting to look to nanosecond trading and short-term booms and busts. However, for our big investments, thinking in terms of our longer-term scale is good enough, not only for your mind, but it is good for bottom line. We have seen firsthand at the Amana Mutual Fund group, a long-term horizon keeps our costs low and our discernment sharp to ensure we align our investments with our core belief. So the core message in our book is that for what shall it profit man if he shall gain the world and lose his own soul? So we don't want to just gain profits and in the process we lose our soul. In chapter 3, we begin with, I have a dream that one day all people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims together will build centers of worship of Abrahamic faith. The center can operate with 3 times of utility and at a third of a cost. They will welcome not only Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but every person of any faith or no faith at all. And if I share any lasting lesson about that, the Abrahamic tradition can teach us about prosperity. It is the importance of giving back to the entire cycle of wealth creation. The financial results of giving are guaranteed. As the preacher has promised to his readers, they are backed by the full faith and credit of the word of God. In Islam, it is not a problem to want to be rich, but it is a problem to be greedy and only self-interested with that wealth. Islamic traditions have many safeguards to keep us focused on using wealth to keep our families, our communities, and our planet. One piece of advice I always give to young people is that when you get your first paycheck, write a check to your favorite charity. It does not matter which charity and or how much it is. Helping others feels good, and we can grow that feeling with discipline and practice. In Islam, the rules are very clear in terms of how much we give in tithing and how much we contribute to other causes. Muslim believes that clear rules reduce questions and uncertainty. As I understand from Gary and others, Christian traditions have adopted a less codified approach. Nonetheless, the same underlying principle is there. Wealth is not something to be hidden or ashamed of or hoarded. Wealth is part of full life, using our faith to guide how we seek and manage wealth is part of living holistically and being fulfilled. In writing Heavenly Returns, we hope to offer others a tool to unite these domains and have fuller, more abundant lives. May we all live in peace with wealth to share. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Yaqub did an excellent job of describing our book. I would like to explain why I think the book is timely and very important in today's world. First, I should thank all the people at Georgetown University for making this possible. Second, I'd like to thank Yaqub for two things. One, coming up with the idea for this book. I'm pleased to co-author it with him. And the second, with his own work and his mutual funds in particular, he has shown that religion and ethics do not necessarily have to lead to lower returns. The title of our book is Heavenly Returns, which I came up with. And it had double entendre to me. One is that all wealth, as Yaqub mentioned, must be spiritual as well as financial. And second, we believe that spirituality needs to be the basis of not only investing, but everything we do. The oldest saying on Wall Street is that people make investment decisions out of fear and greed. Neither, which our religions teach against, is conducive to higher returns, financial returns, much less spiritual returns. And if we can replace fear and greed with prudence and love and ethics, then I believe it produces higher returns, both spiritually and financially. I'd like to present a different perspective today. You've probably heard about the clash of civilizations. It's much discussed. I have a different perspective. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, once said that our worldviews are built on scripture, tradition, reason, and our personal experiences. So I'm sure you're familiar with scripture, tradition, and reason, being the audience you are. I'd like to describe some of my personal experiences, if you'll forgive using me as an example, but I think it explains my last 30 years, the tensions that we face in our world today and the possible solutions. I was very fortunate. As Yaqub said, I was born in Kentucky on a farm, went to the University of Kentucky to study politics, fundamentalist religion, Southern Baptist. And my first roommate in college was a Muslim from Turkey. He was 16 years old and had come there to study engineering, obviously a very intelligent fellow. And I grew to respect very much his devotion to his faith and his faithfulness. Yaqub and I laugh, but the first morning, I think about sunrise, he was praying. And I think that was a Sunday morning. We'd probably been out on Saturday night. And I think I threw a pillow at him that morning, and we had a discussion about his religious practices, but I grew to admire them. Later in life, when my son was young, we had a neighbor. They were Muslims, and my son played with their children all day, almost every day. And I grew to admire that family as well, and their devotion to family and their faith. And the third was when I served on John Templeton's board. We had a board member named Syed Nasser. That name probably rings a bell with several of you. Dr. Nasser was with, I think, George Washington at the time. I'm not sure if he still is, but all I remember is that everyone on the board, and this was a world-class board, were in awe of his intelligence and what he had accomplished in the world of academia. So what I'd like to say today is that I believe the clash that the world faces today is a clash between the educated and the uneducated. I don't mean to use the word uneducated in a pejorative sense. I'm uneducated in everything from quantum physics to deep space cosmology, which they used to discuss on the Templeton board all the time. But I'm talking about the three main things that I think move the world. There's an old saying, money makes the world go round. Probably truer today than it ever has been in history with financialization of not only America, but the world. The second, of course, is religion. And the third is politics. And I believe my experiences will show that if everyone were educated in those three basic fields, with a little interdisciplinary studies, if you will, of the basics, just the basics, and then let that information and knowledge trickle down to the masses, I think we could solve an awful lot of the world's problems. That perspective began in earnest in 1991 when I wrote my first book. I wrote it for the Episcopal Church. They suggested when they read it that it go commercial, and it was picked up by an evangelical publisher. At the time, being an old Baptist, I didn't know what an evangelical was. It was a subculture of which I was just totally unfamiliar. The book picked up 2 endorsements, however. The first was from Sir John Templeton, who became my mentor. John was the founder of the Templeton Mutual Funds, one of the 3 greatest investors of the last century, along with Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch, as voted by Wall Street. But what John was also, my interest in John was that he was probably the most religious financier in the world. He awards the Templeton Prize every year simply because Nobel didn't. And John made his prize larger than Nobel to say that religion's the most important thing in the world. At the time, in 1991, John was saying because of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we were headed for the 20 most prosperous years in the history of the world. He was also saying the stock market was going to boom. The federal debt at that time was of great concern within evangelicalism, and I wrote an article for an evangelical publication on why we believed it was like a bug on the windshield of a car. It was unsightly, we'd be better off without it, but that it wasn't going to stop the progress of the car or the economy. The other, interestingly enough, the other endorsement I picked up was from a fellow named Larry Burkett, who became a friend. Larry was an electrical engineer on 1,000 evangelical radio stations offering financial advice, particularly about debt, credit card debt in particular. But being of that interest, he gravitated into the world of the federal debt and became a critic of the federal debt, which was $5 trillion at the time. His book, The Economic Earthquake, in 1993, sold over 1 million copies, which is a tremendous number of books. That influenced Pat Robertson to have a similar perspective. Even Bob Schuller, on whose board I served, who was Mr. Positive Thinking, was talked into putting his name on a book. He didn't write it, but he put his name on it as an author, co-author. And if you think about it, it was about the federal debt and had a similar perspective. And that's about the negative side of America's balance sheet. And when I was invited to be on the air with him, I discussed the positive side of America's balance sheet and basically explained why the federal debt was a bug on the windshield of the American economy at the time. But that perspective was so prevalent, all of this, that the American Bankers Association, I was on UPI radio at the time doing financial commentary, and the American ABA asked me to do a series of commentaries on why the debt was not a big deal and remind people that the War of the Worlds was a fictional broadcast, radio broadcast, but it caused panic in the United States anyway. And what they were concerned about is these fellows were telling everybody to take their money out of the banks, which of course in a fractional reserve banking system would mean that there was not enough money in the banks for everyone to get it. The Federal Reserve actually printed a ton of extra money, which fortunately they did not need for Y2K. And anyway, that's how serious it was. It mentioned Y2K. At that time, I had moved on. UPI had gone bankrupt. I moved on to the Skylight Radio Network, which was hundreds of evangelical radio stations. And they were into Y2K at the time. And at a meeting of all the managers of the radio stations for Skylight, they asked me to debate a young lady who wrote a bestseller about how Y2K was essentially going to be the end of the world. When I presented when I gave my arguments, I told them basically that I live in Florida and I keep 5 gallons of water just in case of a hurricane, and that was all I was going to do for Y2K. They virtually laughed me out of the room, and I was shunned the rest of the meeting. But of course, that's basically what happened. The national religious broadcasters knew what I had said about the federal debt. And Brent Gustafson, who was a friend of mine, asked me to write an article, cover story for NRB magazine. And it was called Y2K, the Millennial Bug. And the reason that I tied it to stewardship, Christian stewardship, is that studies show that the more fear you have over events like the federal debt, Y2K, and so on, the less people give to charitable causes. It makes a lot of money, obviously, for the people preaching the debt, but it hurts giving to everyone else. The next thing I guess I sort of disagreed with evangelicalism about was Donald Trump. Richard Nixon one time said that it is fear, not money, and not love that makes the world go round. And he pointedly said they don't teach you that in Sunday school, but it's true. And I believe that since the days of Nixon, that the GOP, of which I was a part, has increasingly utilized fear to exploit people's anxieties over the federal debt. Obviously, if you think the federal debt's earth-shaking, you're going to vote for fiscal conservatives. It's just that simple. And that meshed very easily with the evangelical worldview. If you know anything about what's called premillennial dispensationalism, it basically means that the world's going straight downhill until the good Lord returns, and then we'll finally have peace on earth. The other worldview says, like John Templeton had, is that we're making progress. John was a big believer in progress. And then we'll have 1,000 years of peace on earth, and then the good Lord will return. It's a totally different worldview, pessimism versus optimism and hope. What a lot of people didn't know about Trump, of course, who began his campaign on a very anti-Islamic agenda, I believe, was that Trump in 2011, as a businessman, did a special for the Discovery Channel in which he estimated that America's net wealth, after all debts are paid to everyone else, was $260 trillion. Today, the federal debt's still only $25 trillion, I think. But basically, he knew and understood, that's probably an exaggerated figure, by the way, but he basically knew that America was an incredibly wealthy country. But yet, when he got into politics, he started preaching that the federal debt was going to hurt us and that the economy was terrible and we need to make America great again, especially economically. The reason I think all of that is important, and this is the key point I want to make, is I grew up with an uncle who was just a little bit older than I was. He was like a big brother to me, I think 4 years older. Looked up to him and we were great friends. And I noticed during the early 90s that he had begun reading this right-wing propaganda that the federal debt was sinking America. And Trump was running for office. My uncle began to talk to me about how in another 10, 20 years, America is going to be living under Sharia law. He basically said the Muslims were taking over the government and so on, and the Trump agenda therefore appealed to him to that fear. And I said, you know, don't you know that only 3 Muslims out of, 530 members of Congress are Islamic? And the other thing is we have an establishment clause in the Constitution that says government can't establish any religion even Christianity, which we sort of do, but we specifically can't have Sharia law, everyone living under it, even Christians, when there are only 3 members of Congress who are Islamic, and we have an anti-establishment clause. But the very fact, and the point is he hasn't talked to me since we had that discussion. And if that can separate people who are in essence brothers, particularly brothers in Christ, as we Christians say, the fear is simply, as the good book says, Christian scriptures, there is no fear in love. And if we can simply educate people on these basic religion, politics, and money that we are made so fearful of by the media and politicians, it's almost a military industrial complex between politicians and the media. Fear sells. It's just that simple. I learned that in the media. Then we will produce a world that I think we want to leave our grandchildren as opposed to the one we are today. And that's where the role of education is so very terribly important. Sir John used to teach us that worldviews begin at the top. He always said money may not trickle down, but influence does. And if we can educate people with interdisciplinary studies at the collegiate level at Georgetown, then when those people go out in the world, it will filter down to the employees and the readers of the media and the people who vote and so on. And that's the way we're going to overcome this clash of civilizations, or the clash of the educated versus the population and so on. And that's what I'd like to say today.
Thank you very much, Gary. Now I'll turn it over to Andrew for our Q&A period. Andrew?
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you both Mr. Moore and Dr. Mirza for your talks. So our first question comes from an anonymous attendee who says, Mr. Moore, in the first chapter of your book, we read that understanding the Quran is virtually impossible without a foundational understanding of Jewish and Christian scripture. Can one of you explain this in more detail?
I don't remember saying that. I think it was actually backwards. I don't think we can understand Christianity without understanding the Torah of Judaism and what the Quran teaches, the first 5 laws. For example, when I moved into the world of evangelicalism, they have a lot of authors who write Christian financial books, Christian per se. And one thing I noticed is almost all of it is the teachings of Moses and Solomon and so on. In other words, the Jewish scriptures. Jesus had a very simple financial plan. He said, sell what you have and give to the poor. That doesn't sell well in America. So I think it's crucial basically to understand that if, for example, I tell people, if you want to invest biblically, evangelicals don't call our type of investing socially responsible investing. They don't like the word social. It brings up socialism and so on. They call it BRI, biblically responsible investing. And yet, if you want to invest biblically, okay, you might want to consider Yaqub's funds, which are Islamic. The reason is the Muslims still do not earn interest. It's against the religious principles. Christianity changed that with the founders of the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. They began to allow the legitimate earning of interest, morally legitimated, with very strict moral parameters, foundations with it. Those have been loosened and loosened and loosened until the point that today, if you ask evangelicals, is it biblical to earn interest? The typical response is, of course, it's only good stewardship to earn all the interest you can. And they just simply do not understand enough about the scriptures. Christianity Today once called the Bible the greatest story never read by evangelicals. They simply don't understand that those biblical principles of Moses are still practiced by Islam today.
So Andrew, if I can add, when I was researching for my first book, Five Pillars of Prosperity, I felt that if you look at Old Testament, then New, and then Quran, there is a story being built up. And as you know, as Muslims, we are to believe in Old Testament, New Testament, and then Quran. For example, if you look at tithing, it was 10% for the Jews, the Christianity, some talk about 10, some say it is less, and there's no concept of nisab, and that is a minimum required money for a family to live for 1 year. And then when you come to Islam, the rules become more clear, more defined, and it also defined nisab. So we are not to give out money as tithing if one is below nisab. And what is nisab? I would suggest is poverty level. We don't want people to live at a poverty level, but to avoid arguments, we say, okay, it's a poverty level. So if somebody living in this area, we can say the family of 4, this poverty level may be 35,000. So if somebody has more than 35,000, you pay on the difference, which is above 35,000. If one is below 35,000, you don't pay any tithing, but you can receive tithing. So to me, there has been a growth. Similarly, if you look at inheritance, you look in the books of Moses, in Jewish tradition, as I understand it, when somebody died, it goes to the son. And in Christianity, the concept is, as Gary mentioned, you sell everything and give away everything, and you come and join me in heaven. But in our case, as Muslims, inheritance laws are very much defined. And as I did the research, I found that Islam is the first religion among the all organized religions who give right to a woman to inherit as a wife, as a daughter, as a sister. So it is, to me, it is succession. You just go through and you find that there is a refinement, and there is a finality. So we do believe in the Old Testament, New Testament, and then the Quran being the final message.
It looks like we actually have a question from Dr. Brown. So Dr. Brown asks, first question, can you, I'm guessing he's addressing both, think of an example of worldview trickling down in a positive way recently? Second question, how does the Islamic rule of interest affect shared Abrahamic views on investing?
I hadn't thought much about that. I do know, if I could go back to my experiences in evangelical subculture, is that there was a gentleman named Mark Knoll, who was professor of Christian thought at Wheaton College, the Mecca of evangelicalism, who wrote a book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. This was 15, 20 years ago. And in it, he made the comment, and that was so meaningful to me. He said, in essence, that there is great work being done in the scholarly community on these matters, but it has been decimated by the popular media. As I said, an electrical engineer was teaching economics and politics of federal debt. And while Sir John Templeton and the editor of the Wall Street Journal and so on were saying the federal debt didn't amount to much. In a positive sense, from an economic perspective, I can't really think of anyone today. I don't know anyone today that had the worldview of Sir John, that economically, we are making tremendous progress in the world. The number of very, very poor people, I think, still defined as what, $300, $400 a year, or something of that nature, annual income, is growing smaller. The wealthier nations are growing much, much wealthier, especially the United States, at least the upper portion of our population. And I don't know of anyone who's really doing that today. And that's part of the things I'm talking about. It's sort of a shame. I think that's one reason that I had a dear friend who was an evangelical leader who told me one time that Sir John Templeton was his mentor, even though he didn't know him, that he had looked all over the world for somebody other than Andrew Carnegie as a business person he could look up to, and he couldn't find anyone. And so he turned to Sir John Templeton for his worldview, and that way Sir John trickled down. Ironically, John wanted to be a pastor and couldn't sing and couldn't remember names, and he said, "You can't be a pastor doing that." And so he turned to finance, and the irony is God works in strange ways. John probably influenced more people as a mutual fund manager than he did in the pulpit, or would have in the pulpit. But can I name someone today who did what John did of trickling that religious and economic perspective down to the average mutual fund investor, for example? No, I think Yaqub could. It's just that no one, not no one, but a limited number of people, particularly within evangelicalism, which has a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment, is aware of Yaqub. And that's one reason I was so interested in this book. I'd like to get them to read it.
Thank you. So as to the second question, if I understand Professor Brown, you know, we need to design and develop instruments which can undertake an Islamic investing without worrying about the interest. So most of our projects are debt free, so we don't borrow, so we don't have to deal with interest at all. In a minor mutual fund, the amount which is waiting to be invested is kept in a checking account, so no interest is earned on it. I remember back in 86, 85, when we were applying the SEC to approve the fund, this was one of the disclosures they wanted to add, and that is that since the uninvested cash will be sitting idle, not earning any interest, that means return will be low. So we had to disclose that to the investors. As you can see, of course, there's no guarantee for the future returns. We have done quite well, and just by avoiding what we call sin stocks, which is basically tobacco, casino, anything to do with un-Islamic activities, we don't invest in it. And John Templeton took the same approach. He said, EPA is going to get after those people, and therefore it's not a good investment anyway. So fund, just by avoiding those, we have been able to, give a very premium return. I remember we were invested in Enron many years ago, and the company got into trouble. When it was getting into trouble, what they do is they borrow more money, and it reached to a level which was more than 1/3 of the market cap, and we sold our stock. And of course, they kept on borrowing more money. So 9 months from the sale of the stock, the company went to bankruptcy. So it was a very nice kind of rule that we got out because it just had too much debt. and we felt that it's not a good investment. The other example which I've used is that when companies have too much cash, they invest in a money market fund, they earn interest. And when it reaches more than 5%, we also discourage those investments. And the idea there is that companies are in the business of growing business, not keeping a lot of cash and put them into money market funds or into CDs and earn interest on it. And there are examples I can give, but for the same time, I will not get into it. So companies who have a lot of cash is again a sign that the management is stagnant. They don't know what to do with the cash. They don't know how to grow the business. So that again is very prudent to get out of that investment or not to investment to start with.
So we have a question for Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, you say the world economy can hum along quite well if we simply obey the great commandment to consider our neighbor's interests as well as our own in all that we do. Can you give us more examples of how we can do this with our investments?
Sure. What Yaqub and I are advocating is socially responsible investing, sometimes called ethical investing. And as I mentioned, evangelicals call it biblically responsible investing. And I want to drill down a little bit. Sir John avoided the sin stocks of alcohol, tobacco, gambling. He held his stocks 5 times longer than the typical mutual fund manager does. He avoided speculation, and yet he was named one of the 3 greatest investors of the last century by Wall Street. Now, look at Yaqub's fund, the Amana Growth Fund. He's too modest to discuss this. But, you know, John Bogle of the Vanguard Funds used to say that no active fund manager could outperform the S&P 500. And yet Yaqub's fund has done it by 2% annually, which is enormous over the last 15 years. And I think the avoidance of the sin stocks, if you think about it, cigarette manufacturers are a good example. I grew up in that industry in Kentucky. I had all my relatives were involved in it in one way or another. And cigarettes have always been very profitable in older times, but there's so many campaigns by both the medical community and the government today to get Americans to kick smoking that I think in the longer term, people ask me all the time, are ethics important? And I say, not if you're a day trader. But if you invest, truly invest for the long term, as Sir John did and Yaqub does, then they become more and more important for you to avoid industries that are under duress from the government and healthcare officials and so on. Sir John also avoided casino gambling because he thought that it made us more short-term oriented. And today we're involved in so many things of that nature. From government promoting lotteries as an alternative form of taxation and so on. But look into the world of socially responsible investing, including Yaqub's fund. Look into community development banking, for example, if you prefer banking and say more safe investments. You can find those listed. It's called Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFI. I would note, by the way, that there is one group of American Christians who do avoid interest. When I was on the board of Messiah College in Central Pennsylvania, one of the fellow board members was a banker, and he told me that he had special funds for the old order Amish up there who knew that the Bible forbade the earning of interest. And he had special accounts where people could put their money in the bank and not earn interest. I'm sure he sent them a new calendar at the end of every year for that. But I always found that fascinating that some of the old order Amish still understood that. But what I was going to say at one point is that if you're avoiding debt, think about it. What are you left to do with your money? You have to invest it in equities, either real estate, stocks, or whatever. And historically, those investments, equity investments, have done far, far better than investing in debt instruments of bonds and so on. So that's a way, I think, of saying that if we integrate our faith with our management of money and management of wealth, that it will reward us in so many ways, both spiritually and financially.
We have a question here. This is for Dr. Mirza. You emphasize that Abrahamic faiths share a belief that wealth should be invested in socially responsible ways that honor the resources God has provided. In addition to the Amana mutual funds, how can we identify other investments that support conservation, social responsibility, and sustainability?
A good question. There are several funds which follow Islamic principles. In addition to Amana Mutual Fund, we have Iman Fund. There is Azad Ethical Fund. But in addition to funds which follow Islamic principles, we also have Jewish and Christian funds. There is a Ave Maria Fund out of Michigan. I know that fund. I have a list here. I can look up for other funds. There is a Timothy plan. There's a Timothy large mid cap, and there is a Wahid ETF, and then this S&P 500 also have an Sharia compliant index fund. So there are those funds available, and you just have to, to look. There is a great deal of emphasis now and a trend to go for ESG, which is environment, social, and governance, and SRI. And if you simply Google those two terms, you will find many, many funds are becoming available. Even BlackRock, one of the largest fund in the country, have announced that they want to go towards ESG.
We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. They say, thank you for this talk. We need more information about investing in a way that is pleasing to God. What is the best way to invest for retirement, given the current economy?
Gary, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Yaqub. My opinion, and it's only that, is that this is an extremely difficult time for investors. And the simple reason is that assets all over the world have been bid up to historic levels because of the easy money policies of the Federal Reserve of the last 30 years. And also for both Y2K and especially for the recent pandemic, governments have produced an awful lot of money to fight the pandemics. And a lot of that money has gone into the stock market. Corporate profits are at record levels, that's true. But if you look at many other measures of companies to book value, for example, what's called the Q ratio, company value, stock values to what the current value of assets is worth, they're at historic levels. And I believe it would only be natural, and it's sooner or later, economies do adjust to the trend line, if you will, that for the world, for the markets to have a correction. I don't know if that's going to be true. It depends. The Federal Reserve could reverse positions tomorrow and start printing money again and build up the banking reserves or so by buying bonds again. And all of that would be off. But if you just look at pure fundamentals in the stock market, I think you want to be kind of careful today, and especially invest in the soundest companies.
The only thing I will say is that when you look for an investment, which is pleasing God, do that. And keep in mind that why would an investment which is disobeying God's commandments will be blessed and will return higher profits? So, so it's a contradictory that I want to disobey God, but then ask God to bless my investment so I can make more money.
We have another question here for Dr. Mirza. An attendee asks, you describe the relaxation of restrictions against earning interest that results from the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution, and say that some believe this effort has gone too far. What would you say about the credit card companies' practice of generally charging 18% interest and even higher interest rates, over 20%, to people who have lower credit ratings? How might we try and change that?
Well, I'm not a politician. If you want to use a credit card, do what I do. I pay it off every month. So you can make use of the facility which is provided by credit cards, which every one of us, we need it. We can't even rent a car if you don't have a credit card. But you just make sure that it's automatically paid off at the end of the month, so you don't have to deal with interest. 18 to 21% is enormous. It's really usually of the highest order. But default rate on the credit card is so high that they have to charge higher interest to break even. So the best thing is, if you use a credit card, make sure that you pay it off every month.
We have a question in the chat. It is really striking how aligned you both are in your faith commitments and what it teaches you about ethical engagement with other faith traditions. Could you both speak more about the financial connections you made as you worked together?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Gary and I, we agreed mostly on, I would say almost everything, because even on the interest, if you go back many years ago, we agreed that we should not charge interest, or we should not pay any interest. So all the principles which I'm aware of, in which we follow to invest, like we don't want to deal with bribery. We want to be fair in dealing with partners. We want to have witnesses to document all the commitments and promises. We don't want to invest in breweries, casinos, gambling places, hard drugs. All those commonalities are there. I looked into Methodist Church way of investing because of Shenandoah University. 95% of the same principles as we do, except for Christianity allows investing in bonds, or so to speak, universities invest in bonds, whereas I would not invest in any interest-bearing instruments, whether they are bonds or money market funds or CDs. So really, it's pleasing to see that there is commonality among us, Abrahamic faith, Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
The critical difference, I think, not critical, but important difference between Islamic philosophy of managing wealth and the Judeo-Christian in today's world is a matter of interest. And if you're going to look into the world of socially responsible investing, or ESG investing, it's also called, is you want to be aware of. Let me give you a personal example. I was asked one time to speak at Pat Robertson's for a financial conference. And I heard one of their gentlemen introduced a new ethical mutual fund for evangelicals. And as he finished, I walked around the room and picked up a prospectus for it to just take a look at it. And the number one holding was a credit card company. And so here, if you were Islamic and seeking to honor your faith by not earning interest, you might have picked up a socially responsible fund and not realized that the largest holding was a credit card company charging 18% interest. So you have to look a little bit down. All socially responsible funds are not the same. For example, I told a publication one time, they asked me, what is socially responsible investing? I said, it's different things to different people. Most of SRI prefers to, for example, the Mennonites have their own mutual fund, and they're pacifists and they want to avoid the defense companies. On the other hand, the Timothy Funds, which is evangelical in Orlando, started a fund one time called the Patriot Fund that would only invest in defense companies. So again, you have to nuance. It's not one world. It's again, two cultural distinctives.
We have a question in the chat from a Mary Scott. Mary asks, in Islam, it is required to give 3% of income and capital investment, homes, 401ks. That would be 3% above $35,000 in total assets, if she was correct. If so, it seems like that would be more than the investment growth. Is this accurate?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is a little bit complex. When I talked about 35,000, that is annual income, or that is what you have in savings. So if somebody is earning, let's say $60,000, you pay 2.5%, not 3%, 2.5%, what is above 35,000, which is $25,000. So 2.5% of that will be like $625. That's what you pay. Then you look at your savings, which have been there for 1 year at least, and you look at the growth in that saving. If you have invested that money in stocks, then you are participating in active investments. You are participating in economic activity and helping people to get jobs and so on and so forth. So let's say you have $100,000 invested, and you, at the end of the year, you have $110,000. So you pay 10% of the 10,000, which is $1,000. 100,000 is exempt because it is active investment. On the other hand, if you have put $100,000 in bonds, and the end of the year you get 2%, which will be $102,000, then you pay 2.5% of the whole amount, 2.5% of the $102,000, which is more in tithing than if you had put in stocks or active investments and paid 10% on the growth.
It looks like we have one more question. So this question, it looks like it may be for Mr. Moore. For Christian communities for whom the notion of end time preparation is central to tithing and community giving, what would be the best way for Christian thinkers to encourage a non-fear-based approach for fundraising without conflicting with differences in belief practices?
It's an interesting question. And I think it was 1998. There were all these end of the world books coming about the change in the millennium. And my evangelical publisher asked me to write a book about that. It was so prevalent. And I actually wrote a book called End Times Money Management. And it basically said, if the world is about to end, you don't want to be hoarding gold coins and treasury bills and all the things everybody was doing. It's the exact opposite. Jesus taught a parable one time about a master who entrusted his wealth to some stewards, managers, if you will. And the master went away and he came back, and one of them had hid the money in the ground, hoarded it, in other words. And the master condemned that particular individual. And yet here we were doing exactly the same thing that the good Lord told us not to do if he were to return. So what I would say is if the world is going to end, I would listen to Martin Luther. He supposedly said, and I think it's one of those fictional things that's sort of like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, if you will. But Luther supposedly said if he knew the world was going to end tomorrow, he would plant a tree today. And actually in Wittenberg, Germany, where Luther was, I visited there not long ago, they actually have an area blocked off 3 or 4 acres, I guess, where you can now plant a tree and have it grow. And at all these times when everyone's talking about, the world surely ending with all the things going on. But I'd also remind them that Jesus said until the end of time, there'll be wars and rumors of wars. And you can see that politically, spiritually, or economically. But we've been believing, many Christians have been believing these things since the days of St. Paul. The hoarding's been going on. A lot of people think he took up the great collection referred to in the Christian scriptures because he nearly caused a depression with some of his teachings that Jesus was going to return immediately. So I would simply say to plant a tree today, invest in Yaqub's fund or another good fund, and the world ends. What difference does it make?
So Andrew, if I can go back to the question of tithing, I'm very big for giving, and I believe that we should give while we're living, not leave it to upon death and so on and so forth. So we are permitted to write in our will that up to 1/3 can be given to a charity, to a friend, but non-inheritors. But my view is that we don't have to wait for that to happen, because the need is there. People are in need. Students have to get scholarships. So we don't want to create a community unconsciously who is praying for my death. I want people to pray for my health, not for my death. That when he's going to die, so I can get the 1/3, so I can buy food and then so on and so forth. So living while giving is my theme in the first book. And I was very struck, one of the hadiths of the Prophet, which says that if you give $1 or 1 dirham today while you're living, it's better 100 times than what you give upon death. So that really changed my perception that why would you delay giving to death? Why and lose such a large reward which is there? So giving while living is really the theme which I'm sort of following now. My good friend Dr. Jamal Brazindi and I, we both agree to this, and that's what we try to practice. That let's give out now so people can use it, benefit from it, and so on and so forth. The other distinction I want to make is that in case of Christian, at least what I know, we give tithing to the church, and it is the discretion of the church to use it the way they like. And of course, they have deacons and the board, and they all decide what to do with it. In our case, Quran defines where the charity should be given or used for. There are about 8 categories defined, and none of them is to give it to the mosque or give it to the church. Now, we may give it to the mosque for the administration purposes, but they are not supposed to take that money and use it whatever they want to do with it. And surprisingly, the 8 categories are so broad. It talks about the needy, the poor, and the needy, and the people who collect zakah. That kind of implies that there's organized way of collection, and the people who collect zakah, they can also be compensated with it. The people whose heart have been reconciled, people whom you want to be friend with. Someone I was talking to, they said, well, you can use zakat for political contributions because you are trying to basically bring these people closer to you. You can give to free captives, or the people who have lost their hometown. Many people who, when Kuwait was invaded, many Kuwaitis, they drove their cars into Saudi Arabia. And they had beautiful cars, all those expensive cars, but once they got there, they don't have the money even to buy gas. So The Saudis, the host family, they basically use zakah money to feed them and to host them. So it's a much broader, the implementation of zakah. And we have sponsored a research at Indiana University in the School of Philanthropic Giving to research how zakah can be implemented in North American context. Because some of these things which I've talked about, they may not be relevant here, but there are many things which we practice in US. Are they eligible for zakah dollar to be spent on it or not? So I just want to clarify that.
Well, I think that we're out of questions. So let me thank our two speakers for a very stimulating discussion. And as somebody who, as I said before we came on the air, has a problem dealing with numbers, I think I was able to follow most of the conversation here. And I want to encourage those that are watching this and to think about buying the book and reading more on it, because there's a lot more there, obviously, and in detail. So thank you all for joining us today, and particularly thank you, Dr. Mirza, and thank you, Gary Moore. It's been a pleasure.